What is going on, guys? Shooting Dave here. Welcome back to the channel. So good to see your smiling faces. How good was that intro, right? I worked pretty hard on that and I'm pretty stoked with it. So that means we're back again with another image breakdown, and this time it is the Rebellion Force Racing E30 wide body, envisaged by Kaisel Salim and fabricated by Rebellion Force Racing. And I shot this at Race Service. So big thank you to Race Service for allowing me to use your premise to do it, and congratulations Kaisel and Rebellion for making such an awesome vehicle. Like, it is really cool and I'm so stoked to be able to shoot it. Okay, so let's jump straight into this. So what did I shoot this on? Well, I used a Canon 5D Mark III, a Canon 35mm f2 non-IS lens, and I used a light, which I use for light painting. If you haven't seen what light that is, there's a little video up here which you can check out. So all of these were shot at ISO 100 f8, and the exposure times for the car were 10 seconds, and for the car lights, anything from 1 to 10 seconds. So jumping into Lightroom, the first thing I do here is I go through and I just basically scrutinize each image, going backwards and forwards and seeing which light passes look the best. Once I've made my selections, I then go through and basically just do some minor adjustments inside Lightroom, which makes light painting and editing a bit easier inside Photoshop. So I remove camera distortion, I remove chromatic aberration and vignetting, and I get rid of that little purple haze that no one likes to see. I then also lift up the shadows a little bit and drop the highlights, just so there's a bit more range inside the image to work with. That way, you know, it's easier. You can always add contrast later. It's better to do that than starting with a super contrasty image and then trying to reduce that later on. It just gets a bit messy, a bit murky, and the image starts to fall apart. And then once I've made my selections, I basically round them all up, go photo, edit in, and edit inside Photoshop. So basically I open all of these up as layers inside Photoshop, and it will automatically stack them on top one of each other inside Photoshop. So once we're in there, basically all I do is I go down layer by layer, giving each layer a name so I know what pass is what and what part of the car it is lighting up. I go through and do all of that all the way down to the bottom, and then what I do is I select all of the images and I align them. So no matter how good your tripod is, there is always going to be a little bit of discrepancy, and it's better to tackle that now rather than wait until you're halfway through the edit and realise that your wheels are about 5 centimeters off. No one wants that, so let's do it now and get rid of it. Alright, so once we've labelled all of our layers, it's time to start grouping them so that we can work on different parts of the image. Now, I prefer to work on background, car, and then car lights. It's just easier for me, and it's a nice way to know which part of the image you're working on specifically. So once I've grouped all the passes that I deem to be relevant for the car, I'll put them into a folder. I'll then go around with a pen tool, path all the way around the car, and then I will apply that to a mask on that group. So that way I can affect only the car and leave the background and car lights to be what they want to be. And depending on which mood I'm in, I'll either work on the background first or I'll work on the car first. So basically I turn all of the layers on, turn on each one individually and see what it's doing. Typically I start with the side of the car, so I'll go around, make some adjustments, turn it on and off. Is this one good? Is the next one better? Now you'll note in the stack that I've got quite a few passes for the side of the vehicle. They aren't all going to be used. I just have them in there so that I have a selection and I can go through and refine that selection. So you'll see that I'll start binning off some of these layers and whittling it down to the minimum amount of pass. This not only makes it cleaner and easier when editing, but it also makes your file a bit lighter so you don't have a super heavy file. So I'll just work around the car, starting with the side. I'll then make sure I've got that looking how I want it. For this one, I didn't like how the windows were looking, so I actually took another pass, masked out the windows and just set that to normal mode above the other image. So in order to get all of these layers to show up above each other, the blending mode you want to use is lighten. And then once I'm happy with how the side of the car is looking, I'll then move on to the front and I'll find the exposure that I like the most and just brush that into where it wants to be. So sometimes you can just get away with using a layer by itself as lighten, but if it has areas you don't like, you can always just chuck a layer mask on there and brush it out. And you'll also note that I start putting curve adjustments into some of these layers, and sometimes if I want to affect just a certain pass rather than everything below that curve adjustment, I will actually just hold down Alt or Option if you're a Mac user and clip it to that layer, so that way those curves will only affect that layer. So after we've got the front in place, it's time to start working on the wheels. Now I typically do 1 or 2 exposures for the wheels. That's just, you just go and stand next to the wheel and hold the light, move it backwards and forwards, so you just get a bit of bounce reflection as well as a bit of cast reflection from the light itself. So what do I mean by that? Well, the wheel will see the light move across the image, and that will trace a white reflection, but also the reflection bouncing off the floor back into the face of the rim as well, depending on how shiny the rim is, of course. That is what I mean by that. So you get a bounce and a cast light reflection. So yeah, I use two different exposures. This one for the front wheel, one for the rear wheel. And I'll be honest, it's not always necessary. These are quite dark rims, so I really wanted to make sure that they popped. So that's why I included here. With lighter wheels, sometimes it's not necessary. They just look a bit too stuck on. So it's up to you whether you want to use those or not. And I just added a bit of contrast into the image as well, just to that car group, because I felt like it was a bit too washed out, a bit too open, as I would say. So you just want to darken the shadows a little bit and just push the highlights up a bit. So now that I'm happy with the contrast on the car, it's time to start having a look at the background. So I thought the background again was a little too open, so I just added another curves adjustment in there, really just dropping the shadows down and pushing the highlights. It's just an S curve, everyone does it, and I'm no stranger to it either. So then we started working on the car lights. So I actually used these as blending mode screen, and I liked what they were doing, but there was just too much cast on the background, and I didn't really feel like it suited the background, so I just basically masked it to only the car, and I had a mask already assigned to the car group, so just drag that mask over and then brush out some bits that I didn't want to use in the end. So yeah, so it's just basically, I only wanted it to show up in the window and not so much in the car itself. But one thing I did notice after we dialed in those windows is that there's a lot of unwanted color cast in the background. Now, I wasn't in a totally dark environment. There's a lot of street lamps outside, which are, you getting these like horrible orange glow on the back wall, and I really wasn't a fan of that. So basically I just used a hue saturation adjustment layer and started pulling out some of those colors, like getting rid of the yellows, getting rid of the oranges. I don't want to keep that in there. I wanted this quite a monochromatic looking background against this very vibrant and punchy looking car. So yeah, that hue saturation layer had a mask on it. I didn't want it to affect the car, but only the background. So you basically invert the car mask and apply it to that hue saturation layer. And yeah, I just dialed it in until I was pretty happy with it. And then from there, I just went through and made some minor adjustments to the rest of the vehicle before it was time to clean up. Now, clean up on this one is basically, you want to look, after looking at this image all the way through the edit, you'll start noticing that there's highlights that you don't want, or there's unwanted reflections that you don't want. So I did this in two different ways to clean up. I'll make two cleanup layers. One is I use the clone stamp or the healing brush, and I'll go around and basically just clone out small reflections, bits of dirt, artifacts, stuff you don't want. And then for larger areas of the car that I want to clean up, I'll basically get the paintbrush out and sample a layer, or sample a color that is close to what I want to paint over, and I'll just paint it over. And then once I've gone around the whole car and done that, then I add a little bit of noise to that and then just blur it so it matches. So the level of noise that you want to add, that really depends on your kind of camera. I mean, for me, it's about, I'd say like 0.5%, 1% amounts of noise, and then you just give it a blur by about 1 pixel or something like that, just to soften it around so it doesn't look so jarring. I mean, you won't notice it unless you're super up close and personal with it, but for me, it just helps bed it in and makes it look less jarring. And then also on the cleanup layer, I went around and completed some of the white highlights or reflections from the light, because they got a bit patchy in places, and this is my fault, nothing to do with the car. So I just went around and made sure that they all look the way they should. Yeah, that's looking pretty nice now. So yeah, once I made a few final adjustments to the car itself, it's time to bring it back into into Lightroom. So all you have to do is just save it in Photoshop, and it'll open itself back up in Lightroom. And this is typically where I like to finish off my images. I mean, some people rather do it in Photoshop, but for me, it's easier to carry across that kind of final look onto multiple images if you're working like that, rather than having to make the same color adjustments inside Photoshop. So that's just my personal workflow. I prefer to work that way. You might be different, and that's fine. This is the beauty of it. There's no right way of doing it. So inside Lightroom, all I did was basically dial in some more contrast. So just drop the exposure down a little bit, which actually in the end result I cleared off. I didn't like that negative 1/3 exposure drop. I actually brought it back up to 0. But yeah, just dropping some of the highlights. I tend to work by pressing J on the keyboard so that I can see what's clipping, where my shadows are clipping, where my highlights are clipping. This is just a habit I've got into. I used to work with print magazines and such, so they can't print anything that's gone beyond black, and they can't print anything that's gone beyond white. So I just like to make sure that my images are pretty much within range. There's no harm in having some of the shadows go beyond black, but you don't want anything really on the car going beyond black or beyond white, because well, it just looks messy and it'll look crap in print. So that's my piece of advice to you. So yeah, I just dropped the blacks a little bit, pushed the whites up a little bit, gave the image some texture and some clarity, and then some vibrance, and before moving into the curves, just again giving it a bit of an S-curve, but also lifting the black point up a little bit so there's 0 blacks in the image, but then pulling those shadows down to make sure it doesn't look too filmic, or you know, that horrible phase where there was no blacks and it was all muddy. So yeah, just dropping the shadows down a little bit, holding the highlights roughly where I had them, so a little bit punchy. And then I go into the different channels. So for blue, I will go in and push some blue into the into the shadows and drag them out of the highlights. This will give blue shadows and yellow highlights. It's kind of cinematic kind of look that I go for. And also going into the red channel as well, I will drag out some of the reds out of the shadows and then hold them in the highlights, and this just introduces a little bit of teal. It's just the way I like it. Maybe it's a bit heavy-handed for some people, but I like the way it looked on this image. And then I thought, well, let's try and rein in some of that focus towards the car. So I just added a 2/3 of a stop ND neutral density grad filter from the top of the image, so just down towards the top of the car, and yeah, that was pretty much it. And then as you see on the left of the car, there's this like pool of light, which is where I actually created the shadow for the car. And all I wanted to do is just pump up that exposure a little bit and just push a little bit of clarity in there so it looks a little bit punchy. And once that was done, it was really just going back through the HSL tab and having a look in there. So neutralizing the oranges, and then just giving a bit of saturation to the blues. Just making sure that the car looked the way I wanted it to do. And then onto sharpening. So a lot of people question the amount I use. I use quite a high amount, but I'll get to that in a second as to why I do that. And then just increasing the radius until we start seeing some of that detail come through, and then pushing the detail up. So I actually use masking on this. So you're right, I do use a lot of sharpening, but the masking just holds it to the fine detail edges rather than just globally sharpen the image. That's why I use a lot, and that's why I mask it off quite a lot. And then just really adding some noise reduction, not that it needs a huge amount, but just might as well do it just to make it as clean as it can possibly be. And then yeah, just going through and dialing in the luminance of red, orange and yellows, as well as bringing up the green a little bit. So yeah, that's the end result, and I'm pretty happy with it, to be honest. It really does suit the style of the car. So massive thanks to Rebellion Ford Racing for allowing me to shoot the car. Congratulations, Kaizel, on actually having your design come to life. And thank you so much to Race Service for allowing me to shoot in your wonderful facility. I actually saw this car at their Rise and Shine event the week before, so I got talking to the owner, Ross, and we actually agreed to shoot this car at Race Service, and Race Service were nice enough to allow me to do it. So thank you guys. And if you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any comments or questions on anything I went over in the editing here, and you want to know more, please don't hesitate, let me know down below. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, I'll be much obliged, and follow me on Instagram. I'm at Shooting Dave. You can find more of my work up on there. And I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya.